Did you know that the Ten Commandments are, well, not 10? Wait, what? Well, how do you know there are 10? If you go into the Old Testament, there are two passages where the commandments are spelled out. One is in Exodus chapter 20, and the other one is in Deuteronomy chapter 5. But there's no numbers there. And if you count all the commandments that the Lord gives to Moses, they're not 10. In fact, if you run a simple experiment and just have different people, 100 different people, read those passages of the Old Testament without them knowing that the commandments are 10, and pose the simple question, how many commandments did God give Moses? Probably people would come up with several different numbers. People would probably say something like maybe 12, maybe 13, maybe 10, maybe 9, maybe 11, because there's no number in there. And it's not obvious how you should group them to get to the magic number of 10. This is so true that if you think about Jews, Catholics, Orthodox, Lutherans, Reformed, they all agree that the commandments are 10. But if you look at which commandment is which, they all disagree. So, first of all, how can we even be sure that the commandments are really 10? Well, we do know that the commandments are 10 because there are other passages in Exodus and Deuteronomy in different chapters where it says that Moses received from God 10 commandments. So the problem is, how do we reconcile this number that we know it's true because it's given in other passages with the list of commandments that is much larger than 10? So let's take a look at the commandments and try to make sense of them. So here we have the commandments. At the beginning, there is an introductory statement from God that says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. And then a series of commandments follow. But if you number them according to the you shall or you shall not do something, well, you will see easily that you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, at least 13 commands. So, how can we reorganize these 13 to make the magic number 10? Well, if you ask a Jew, well, he will tell you that this first introductory statement is actually a commandment itself. When the Lord says, I am the Lord your God, well, that's the most important commandment of all. So, why should we consider this as just an introduction? This is the first commandment for the Jews. But for every other Christian, that is not the first commandment. This is the first commandment. All right, so first distinction. Now, what about the second commandment? Well, you shall not have other gods before me is considered can be considered to be the very first real commandments. Okay, but what about this part and this part? Well, you see that it says, you shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. And then it goes on, you shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. And then it keeps going. Well, you could safely assume that these two pieces go together because it says you should not make for yourself a carved image, meaning an idol, and you shall not bow to them. So there's a reference to these images, to these idols. So definitely these two commands go together in the same commandments. But are these two together a separate commandment from this first one here? Well, there's a huge debate around this. For example, if you ask Catholics or even Jews, They will put this whole block into one single commandment. For the Jews, this would be the second commandment. But for the Catholics, that would be the first commandment. But they both agree that all these paragraphs constitute one single commandment. Why? Because it talks about the same thing, that you shall have no other gods before me, and you shall not make other gods other than myself. You shall not make images and idols, and you should not worship them, because I am the Lord your God, and I am the only God, right? So that's the meaning. So Catholics think that all these things go together. If you ask Lutherans, they also agree on that. But if you ask Reformed, basically Calvinists, and all the Reformed theologies deriving from Calvin, they will say, no, 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 no. The first commandment is this one: you shall have no other gods before me. And this is the second commandment. So the second commandment, usually in the Protestant world, is you shall not make for yourself a carved image. This is the source of a great friction between Protestants and Catholics here in the United States. Usually, Protestants accuse Catholics of having taken out one commandment, having erased one commandment from the Ten Commandments. Which commandment? This one. You shall not make for yourself a carved image. Well, why? Because, of course, when we make a list of all the commandments, we usually don't write all these paragraphs. We just write the initial sentence, which is a simple summary of the commandment. So, in the Catholic list of commandments, you're going to have as the first commandment, you shall have no other gods before me. All this paragraph here is omitted because it's just contained in number one. And then they jump to number two: you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. And of course, if you look at just the summary of the commandments, this part, you shall not make for yourself a carved image, just doesn't appear. It's included here. It disappeared. All right. But Protestants, remember, have this as their second commandment, and they summarize it with the initial part of it. So you shall not make yourself a carved image becomes itself the second commandment. And then you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain becomes the third commandment. And so you see how easy it is to say, oops, Catholics, they erase one commandment from their list of commandments. Why? Well, because it has all to do with the idea of carving yourself images. And you know the big debate between Catholics and Protestants, with Protestants accusing Catholics of worshiping statues, right? It all comes down to this misunderstanding on what the second commandment is. Of course, Catholics, is not that they erase this commandment because they still want to worship statues, even if God said that you shouldn't. In fact, Catholics do not worship statues. But the point is that there's no trick here. There's anybody trying to deceive anybody by canceling commandments from the list of commandments. It's just a simple, different rearrangement, which, by the way, is consistent with the same Lutheran view and even the original Jewish view. So let's do a little table here. We're gonna do Jews, we're gonna do Catholic, and we're gonna do Protestant. Okay, so this first, I am the Lord, is for the Jews, the first commandment. And for Catholic and Protestant, is not a commandment. All right. Then you shall have no other gods before me. That becomes the second for the Jew and the first for the Catholic, up to here. Okay, this is all the second for the Jews, the first for the Catholic. For the Protestant, this is the first one, and this is the second one that goes down up to here. All right. And then you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. They all agree is a single commandment, and it's going to be the third for the Jews, the second for the Catholic, and the third for the Protestants. Now, what about the third or fourth commandment, keeping the Sabbath day? Well, there are two passages here, one about remembering the Sabbath and the other one about not performing any work. Well, of course, these two things are related. You should not perform any job during the Sabbath day. So everybody recognizes that these two paragraphs should be part of one single commandment. So this is going to be number 4 for the Jews, and then and for the Protestant, but number 3 for the Catholics. Now, let's keep going on the right hand side here. What happens? Well, here we go on very easily because they all agree that honor your father and your mother is one commandment, shall not murder is another, shall not commit adultery is another, shall not steal is another, shall not bear false witness is another. So you have fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, and 9 for Jews and Protestant, and Catholics trail by 1. All right, like that. Here is where things get complicated because now we get to number 10. So you only have one possibility. Jews and Protestant, they are bound to combine all this into one single commandment. So you shall not covet your neighbor's house or your wife or your servant or your ox or anything that is your neighbor's. All right. And that's what happens for Jews and Protestants. For them, this is one single big commandment about not coveting whatever belongs to your neighbor. Well, the Catholics need to make 2 out of this, otherwise they're not going to get to 10, right? And so Protestants say, well, you're just making up, splitting these in 2 parts just because you have to get to 10. And that's why you cancel the second. Now you are in this position. You have to split one commandment in 2 when it's just actually one commandment. Well, that's not entirely correct. Why? Because it's more confusing than this. In fact, if you compare the 2 passages where the commandments are spelled out, Exodus and Deuteronomy, this last part is spelled out a little differently. For example, in Exodus, first it says that you shall not covet your neighbor's house. And then in a separate section says you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, his servants, his ox, his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's. If you follow the Deuteronomy, though, the first thing that it says is you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, and then all the rest. So what Catholics do is to follow Deuteronomy's wording of this last part, where the wife is put as a separate sentence than all the rest. And they argue that it makes much more sense because coveting your neighbor's wife is not the same as coveting your neighbor's house, because the feelings that you may have towards your neighbor's wife are different. We're talking about 2 different sins. One is lust, the other one is avarice, right? You want to lust with your neighbor's wife or you want to possess. So we're talking about 2 different sins, so 2 different commandments, and it fits the Deuteronomy wording of the commandments. So there's a strong biblical argument that you can make around dividing these 2. So for the Jews, this whole thing remains one block. As for the Protestant, but Catholics say no, wife is 9 and all his possession is 10. All right. So what's the summary here? That we should all relax, because no matter if you're Jew, if you're a Christian, if you're Catholic, if you're Protestants, you all agree that the commandments are 10, and that's a fact. It's written in the Bible, the commandments are 10. The only thing that you will disagree on is the rearrangement and how you group these commands into 10 commandments. But nobody's hiding anything, nobody is tricking anybody else. It's just a different rearrangement of the same commandments. Everybody believes in the same commandments.